So thanks for coming, everyone. I'm Jack Cyprus.
I'm Wyatt.
This is Niall, who's not formally presenting with us today, but was also one of the founders of Embed.
Yeah.
And so is Pseudo up here with us.
We expect him to move over.
I get close to the microphone.
I'm a cybersecurity engineer at MITRE. I work on a lot of critical infrastructure and ICS projects across a lot of different sectors, with the very public ones being both MITRE Embed, and I was one of the core members for MITRE Attack for ICS.
I work at Red Balloon Security with a bunch of really cool security researchers. We do a bunch of offensive and defensive research and products in that area as well.
So,
introduce Niall as well.
Niall, would you like to introduce yourself?
I do stuff and things, subject matter expert in cyber operations, OT, and IC.
Great. So I guess before I get into it, has anyone in here used Embed? Not just heard of it, but used it itself? A couple? Great. Okay. So we'll do a quick walkthrough just so we all know what we're talking about, and then we'll get into the actual operationalizing of it all. So MITRE Embed, it's an embedded device threat model meant for embedded devices themselves, not necessarily the networks that they rely on, but actually building in security to the device. The whole threat model hinges on the threats themselves, which is why they're in the middle here. Our threat data comes from either in the wild examples and seeing adversary examples themselves, or we included a lot of cybersecurity research, including conference talks and papers and things like that, with the idea being that embedded devices are in networks and systems for 10, 15, 20 years. And so the threats that are just kind of research-based today could very well become adversary threats tomorrow. So those threats are then correlated to properties so that you can put in the properties of your device and you can get out a list of threats. These aren't security properties necessarily, just actual inherent properties that your device is going to have and be using, with the idea that those are the actual things that expose you to threats. And then we correlated those to mitigations that are, again, secure by design, with the idea that you're baking in security into your device. You're not just putting it on a secure network, which means nothing until it's not secure. So we see this primarily being used by device OEMs because they're the ones that can build in security themselves. But we also see a lot of use cases that we'll talk about later with security researchers and testers, along with asset owners, to kind of round out the entire embedded device security lifecycle and ecosystem, with kind of not in the OEM case being a very common description, embed being used as a common description between the three.
Hey, one inject here. So three principles here is that it gives us a common language to talk about embedded system. It dissipates the actual black box component around embedded systems because everybody thinks it's a thing that does a thing, right? We don't know anything else. And third is it's meant to raise the security floor. If we're going to fight what we have as challenges in this space, this is the security floor. We raise that floor, we give ourselves an advantage on the field in defending what's out there. So
thank you. Yeah. So if you go to our website and you go to the threats page, this is what it looks like. Our threats are broken up across 4 categories. So hardware, system software is your low level, basic operating software, your device. Application software is the software running on that. And then networking, which are the networking capabilities of your device. Another way you can see threats is through the properties mapper. So this is a bunch of checkboxes split up into those 4 categories. That just consist of properties such that if you have a property, you might be exposed to a threat. And if you don't have a property, you're likely not going to be exposed to those correlated threats. If you don't have a web server running on your device, you don't really have to worry about web server threats. So in this case, we're going to focus on your device having a bootloader, which it very likely might, and the threat correlated with that, which in this case is 201, inadequate bootloader protection and verifications. And again, some properties have multiple threats. Some properties have sub-properties that have one or multiple threats. So it's very cyclical. In a threat, you have a threat description. That threat description has evidence and maturity. The maturity itself is tiered, like I mentioned. So it goes all the way from adversary use to theoretic. And your evidence are just examples and links going back to that maturity to prove that these threats are real and you can kind of investigate the threat further yourself. If you keep scrolling down, you see that threats have CWE and CVE mappings. A lot of people were using them and they wanted them to be included. And we said, that sounds great, let's do it. And then again, threats are mapped to mitigations. Mitigations are tiered: foundational, intermediate, leading, with foundational being very commonly seen, oftentimes open sourced or just open standard mitigations. Intermediate being more complicated, they might require dedicated hardware, proprietary type information, or just aren't widely seen. And then leading are very, very leading. Oftentimes the examples for those, for example, are just research papers.
Right. So mapping this back to critical effect, foundational are things we can do in the next 12 to 16 or 8 months, whatever. Intermediate, maybe. And leading is what we should do so that we're not doing an 18-month sprint, 5, 10, 15 years from now.
Let's add another element. So foundational was meant as a whole tier approach. So it's not so hardware driven in its remediation. So there's a lot of software emphasis there, right? Whereas intermediate and leading based on the cost and other things come into the analysis. I think the other thing was this was meant to turn the dial on the actors without us responding. Why do we play firefighter and whack-a-mole to everything? We know what these things are. Research has talked about it from academia to proof of concept to seeing it in the wild. We should be turning the dial on the actors and we should be evolving faster and ahead of it and then responding versus the inverse.
Exactly. And so if you were to click one of those mitigations, in this case, the intermediate one, a hardware-backed bootloader authentication, this is what a mitigation page looks like. So it's got the tier at the top, description. It then has like notes and considerations. Some mitigations will introduce new properties. For example, this one will, because it's got new hardware. That new property, you might have to go back to the properties mapper, include that you're going to be including that now, which can then lead to new threats, new mitigations, on and on until you kind of go recursively down the rabbit hole of making your device more secure, or not, but you would at least know what you're missing. And then we included 62443 mappings, 4-2, because that's the one that concerns itself with the device itself. A lot of industry were coming to us and saying, hey, we use these mappings in our threat modeling process, and if we're going to use this, they kind of have to be mapped to that. And so we heard that and said, well, we want it to be used, so we're going to include it. You keep scrolling down, we have references. Like I said, these are specific mitigations, they are technical mitigations. And so we're including references with every mitigation to show here's how this is being implemented. If there's implementation guidance, we'll include that from trusted sources. We're not recommending necessarily that you do it one way or the other, but we do just want to give people a kind of launching point on where do I go from here now that I know I need this mitigation, what's next? And then, lastly, we just mapped mitigations to their threats just so you have that back mapping. And if you're saying, wow, this is a lot, yes, we did make it machine readable. So if you have a product or something, product script, anything like that, and you want to do automation so that you're not clicking through this yourself every time, that exists. It's in sticks format. It's just downloadable off the website. I'm forgetting what tab it's under, but if you click around, you'll find it. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Wyatt to start actually talking about how this is being used.
Cool. Yeah. So embed.mitre.org. So EMB3D.mitre.org kind of is where everything that Jack ran you through is there. There's a white paper kind of explaining the motivation of it. But today we're going to be talking about how people are using Embed and how you can use it. And so it's been kind of publicly available for almost over a year now. And we wanted to highlight kind of 3 challenges that we see people using Embed to address. So there's 3 manufacturer challenges and there's like 3 end user challenges. We're going to kind of walk through them both and provide some color commentary. So the first one is, SIS is using Embed. Well, not really, but cool. So the first one is you can use Embed to SIS cites Embed. Yeah, you can use Embed to do secure design. So security by default into devices. And I think this is an area where Embed is kind of moving with a lot of different things with SIS's whole Secure by Design campaign, with how 4.1, 62443 4.1 is moving to kind of up the bar of what default security is. So you can use Embed, click through the properties there, see the threats there, and then try to build in mitigations by default. And I think this quote really captures it. Buyers should seek out threat models that track and incorporate threat sources such as MITRE. But then you go down to what's underlined. Buyers should avoid products that rely entirely on a threat actor never accessing the OT network. I think this is the key kind of point of Embed. Let's put the security in by default. Let's assume things will be connected to the internet and build the security into the device. So like unplugging it from the network and turning it off is not like a Silicon Valley approach to security, not really a practical one. And so like Arius Risk is a company that does some threat modeling, and they're using embed as one of the sources to doing the threat modeling. I think we have some other examples you're going to walk through.
Yeah.
There.
So Xylem is another company. Xylem is a manufacturer themselves, primarily in the water sector, and they are, very commonly seen in the water sector. They're using embed as a data artifact to include in their new threat modeling process. So their new threat modeling process involves a lot of LLMs, and it's a kind of chained process that we'll see on this slide, where they are taking old threat models that they have, they're putting those through the LLM, getting a response, spitting that out, and then they're combining all their old models with embed, kind of running the same process, to then include with, where it says product description in the query, that's the new product that they're going to be making. So they include that along with old examples of threat models and embed artifacts, so they can put that through an LLM and get a new threat model response that includes mappings back to MITRE embed, but also back to their own proprietary information in their old threat models, which they can then run through an evaluation rubric and get a response. So between this being kind of used in-house by Xylem and Arius Risk using it as data artifacts in their threat modeling software, we're really seeing embed be used oftentimes as a very standardized way to handle embedded device threat modeling, which from what we've heard from a lot of our industry partners, or if not partners, just friends in industry, that the standardization of embedded device threat modeling wasn't so much there. So this is being used now quite often for that.
And some feedback we've gotten is that, the hardware and system software properties, threats, and mitigations are particularly useful, both because we really focus on hardware, because we don't need to look at the whole network. We're looking at the device itself as a threat model, but also because some of the threats are research driven. It's not like attack where it has to be observed in the wild to make it a threat. It kind of is more forward looking at to what we know people are doing now, what research is doing now, and what can be done, in 10, 15 years.
I want to inject one thing. So as I was former industry, and the thing that used to frustrate me the most is was the responses of segment and give more physical controls. Like the majority of the assets are on some kind of bad communication network. You cannot put 15 grand into every single site and they're a doorway. I was like, this is bad advice. I mean, I know we have to give advice, but that's the wrong kind of advice. So this is what fostered going into, okay, so we got to rethink about the approach and what we're doing and do this a little bit better. You'll see CD in there, but I don't want you to get hung up on that. We don't want to play whack-a-mole. We're trying to deal with the classes of vulnerabilities, the higher level of design to eradicate having to go play whack-a-mole with every zero. So that's really critical.
Yeah, another way is like alignment with standards regulations. There's lots of standards out there. Man, if you go to automotive conference, like you just say a random string of numbers and then someone will say, I'm on the committee that wrote that.
We love you guys.
Yeah, but one really cool thing that embed, and we're gonna talk about it later, is we find that we tried with embed to meet a middle ground between providing actionable advice, but because embed isn't a standard that you have to certify to, we're a little more flexible, we can be a little more prescriptive. And we're hoping that the mitigations will kind of help guide, because I think one common theme, I was talking to someone yesterday, is that people want to build security in the devices, but the people who are actually building it don't really know, how do we do that? How do we do secure boot and things like that? So we're hoping that embed can be a stepping point to connect research to the actual people building devices. So the 62443-4-2 component mappings is one area. And I was excited from the talk that Andrew Kling gave yesterday, hearing that the 4-1 committee is building in more, they're emphasizing risk modeling as part of a step in terms of raising the minimum bar of security, which kind of sounds like the embed pitch to me. So that was really cool to hear. So this is one interesting use case. You can use embed to do your vulnerability attack surface management. So this is something that a semiconductor manufacturer kind of shared with us, which is that they have a bunch of publicly disclosed vulnerabilities, and they looked at the weaknesses or the CWEs of that, and then mapped it to embed to see which properties were resulting in the most vulnerabilities that they had to do like a disclosure on. And then they were using that to try to guide getting management to agree to investing in security in that area. So kind of using it as a heat map to your device to see, you know, and then you can start the conversation. Do you need this property, which we'll get to a little later in this talk? Do you need that Wi-Fi or Bluetooth connectivity? But also, what mitigations can we build into the device? And so we're hoping to see more of embed being used as a way to kind of take, you know, inform like management decisions about building security into devices, which is probably pretty hard to do. Man, so I think this is a really cool kind of set of recommendations that come out. And this is another good embed use case, which is conformance validation. So the part I really like about this is that embed focuses on the property of the device and mitigating the threats to those properties, but you can also remove those properties. So by focusing on the properties, I'd recommend everyone reading this report. It uses both attack for ICS and embed to inform the threat landscape for OT and ICS devices. And one thing I think is really cool is that there are recommendations to improve 62454-2, and a lot of them are property-based, like physically disabling Wi-Fi capabilities. That isn't like go write everything in Rust. It's like take it out. That's like a pretty, you know, it's something that actually is actionable probably in the 12 to 18 months, but also kind of looking forward. Don't have SSID broadcast enabled by default. Restrict use of removable media. So those first three are just getting rid of a property that, you know, reduces the attack surface. And then encrypting on all external interfaces is introducing a mitigation to a property. So I think, you know, once you start thinking in this property-based approach, you're like by default just getting rid of classes of attacks that don't need to be there. So we talked a little about how asset owners can use embed. We talked a little bit about how OEMs can use it. Security researchers can use it to communicate their findings. So keep doing what you're doing, but then, you know, when you have a finding, try to look up in embed which of the threats and properties does it map to, and then you'll have a direct mapping to mitigations that can be used. So at Red Balloon, when we do device assessments, both like internal research and also commercial ones, and also DARPA ones. So we're working on DARPA approvers as the red team. We try to map all of our findings back to embed properties and threats as well. And that naturally brings the conversation to mitigations. And I think particularly with hardware related things, like a lot of threats are kind of, I don't know, threat modeling seems like it's very nebulous. And so it's very simple to kind of look at this is the threat, this is the property, this is the mitigation. So it's a very simple conversation that you can have. And it encourages you to think about hardware security holistically, I think. Yeah.
So lastly, there are some industry-specific threats that exist out there. So embed is designed to be fairly embedded device agnostic. We're not trying to tailor anything to any one industry very specifically. We've actually gotten feedback that people really like that about embed, that they're not trying to wade through other industries, language or standards or anything like that, but rather that it's all, you know, focused on the device itself. That being said, there are some either industry-specific threats that exist, although many of those do end up getting abstracted and kind of rolled back into embed itself. What's very common is that there's industry-specific lingo that we're not going to be using that then ties into that industry's like operational use case. And, you know, we're not so focused on incorporating everyone else's lingo, but there is clearly room to grow for the threat model in specific industry areas. And so one example that we're seeing is the aerospace industry with currently being performed crosswalk with Sparta. Another one is with the auto ISAC for the automotive space, with the idea being that you can take the more abstract embed proof and threats and mitigations of properties that we have and tie them a little more specifically into what your industry is using to describe and, you know, enact your own threat models there.
Yeah. I think one thing there I kind of want to throw out is, I think my initial, we were very deliberate in the beginning with embed not to make it ICS specific in terms of like, you know, Modbus must have this level of encryption or specific protocols. I think when we initially started talking with the automotive industry, I started looking, I was like, oh man, like it doesn't say CAN anywhere in there. or like, nothing about J1939. So I think it was actually, Niall and I went to an automotive conference a month ago, and it was refreshing. They said, don't put CAN specific things in there. We know that, keep it more high level. So I think there's an interesting conversation to be had about what, at the same time, while CAN isn't mentioned in embed, the discussion of buses is not really kind of as robust as I think it would be. So kind of finding that level. I'm just sharing this because I think it's something we're working through. So if you have ideas about how to address that, like what is the right level of abstraction without getting too industry specific? Yeah, it's one thing that we're kind of.
I'll just add. So the one thing I was concerned about and love attack and attack for ICS as part of that, attack bingo, if you've heard that, didn't want that to happen. We are very protective of embed and how it's being used. I'm currently trying to draft a white paper about some of the other approaches we've been asked as embed, but then have a way to kind of address the more specific areas that we might need to lean into, because people have said, well, I used it this way and it would actually be really helpful. Well, let's do that in a structure, in a way that we can still say it is tied to embed. May not be the core embed element, but it is an embed product, and it's following the guidance that we want to see in is.
So another kind of like live example of this is SAE. SAE is actually using embed. This is a draft. I have to say this is a draft that will not, whatever the process is that will end up being made by them will not look like this. But what's important here is that yellow box in the middle there. So SAE in this case was looking at thermal sensors in EV chargers. And, they have concerns over, thermal management systems being used properly or being attacked or things like that. And so as they're going through their assurance argument to guarantee, or to the best of their ability, highlight how you could guarantee that your thermal management system is properly implemented and secure from attack, is by using embed as an example to show that, we considered possibilities. This was a kind of completeness thing. Embed itself can give a completeness assurance argument to show that, they didn't miss something, or it wasn't like an ad hoc one-off kind of threat model that's not going to be repeatable in the future. Something to say that they have an industry-specific need and threat, but they can use embed to show systematically how these devices are being secured to make their industry-specific argument, in this case, again, thermal management systems on EV chargers. And so we won't run through this, but this is kind of a recap of everything we've covered. Very much top to bottom, from the inception of the device to the deployment, to the management, to the, patching and updates in terms of vulnerability management, attack surfaces, down to, again, like the users themselves and them making sure that they're buying the right products that they think they are. It's the product with the security guarantees that they want in it. And that being communicated or facilitated by, depending on which side you're on, the embed threat model, or if nothing else, it's data artifacts in another tool or another visualization.
Yeah. So I think your homework is to tell us how you're using it. If it's terrible, like what you want to get, changed. If you have a use case that we haven't considered, kind of share that as well. I think we even have like a blog set up where we could have like people, if you want to blog about how you're using it, there's MITRE has a blog that you could blog about. We're trying to gather more feedback so that we're continuously adding to the model, and we want this to be a living document that people actually use for the next 12 to 18 months, but also kind of next decade as well. So your homework is to use it, say what works and say what doesn't work.
Two things. So the versioning is now out there, so you can track the versioning. But we ultimately want to get to, this is my ask, is that every quarter we are doing updates. That's how aggressive. When we talk about turn the dial, right? We need to be ahead of the actor before the actor responds. Every quarter we're doing updates. Constantly going out. If you look at Roadhammer and the way it started in academic and how then it was proof of concept, and that's evolved very quickly. Like these things, that jump happens really quickly. And we wanted to be able to follow the entire.
There's two things. One, how do we contribute to MITRE EMB3D? And two, earlier you brought up the foundational, intermediate, expert. There were where some of those would ever downgrade from medium to entry.
Yeah.
I could go to examples like TPM. We lost the TPM war, now we everything. If that's true, then maybe it becomes foundational.
Yeah.
How are you judging that?
That is exactly what we hope happens. We hope the intermediate of today kind of moves down and becomes the foundational of tomorrow, and leading actually becomes made. Again, leading's a lot of research papers. If someone goes out and researches them, that's great, and makes it easier and implements it. So definitely yes to downgrading. Contributing, you can reach out to us. We are working exactly on what that model looks like, because it's still pretty much the early stages, but we have had contributions, and we have on our acknowledgements page, we have the names of people that have contributed in the past. So yeah, just reach out to either of us and we'll work on that in the back end.
And there's EMB3D
right
that you can email specific.
That too. So yeah, embed@mitre.org. We'll send it to, that's an inbox that we monitor a lot. I'm on that inbox. Sorry, you up first.
Thanks. This is great. I was familiar with Embed, but this is very helpful. Especially today. Question and lay out foundational, intermediate, lead list, right? Can't I look at? I'm saying this in responding, but maybe this you've already thought about this. Leading.
Yeah.
Oh, that's where I should focus. That's where I have the most lead time. Develop and focus. You're behind. This is where you're most behind. There go. This is where I should pay attention.
Well, let me tell you a bigger story about why we got into this. People always used to tell me, well, they can't get a hold of that equipment. I was like, I was just on eBay, and we did it a couple of times. We bought stuff on eBay and had it in. They already know about those things, and they didn't require Embed to do it. These conferences and talks and researchers and academics that are already outlining this, you can get subscriptions to it, you can go find it, you can download it, you can watch it. It's already there. They have the knowledge that's already.
So your calculus is the trade-off is better to inform defenders if we maybe inform a few adversaries along the way, fine, but there's way more defenders that we need to inform. Is that a fair?
Yes, because the problem is they're more informed than we are, and we are now giving the audience, the whole greater general population, the information to say, here's what's out there.
Yeah.
You can think about what's the leading element, right? Or you can think about where we are in the foundation, but you have the whole picture.
All right. And then two comments. One is, I know sometimes the challenge together. So I'm curious. I'm still trying to figure out, should you do that? There's an advantage to keeping them separate. Sometimes that creates blind spots and seams where people don't really additive and multiplicative impact. So that's one. The second is, Wyatt, you asked a question, what is, how do executives, how do you get them to design more secure products? I won't say it's easy, but it's by design, in framing, it's the order wrong. Design first. You have to sit with the design people, understand, if you guys taken product management or done product map, user story, epics, things like that. That's how you plug in. They have their system of how they decide what to prioritize, defer, and redesign. So this has to be in that. And I say that simple, not easy, but you start to speak the dialect, read language, actually, of product design and product management, you can sit right next to them and put this into the user story and go, that firmware mitigation has to be part of this design process.
Yeah,
So,
right. Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And we're hoping that this is a tool. So I'd love to be in those meetings, but the reality is probably a product security person at the vendor who's going to be in the meeting with that team. We're hoping, if they're invited, right? Yeah. And so we're hoping that this is a tool that can be used, so they're not just screaming crazy at the meeting, but they can reference this as a tool. These are mitigations. Look, MITRE said they're good.
Start giving
giving them there.
Yeah.
And I think also on the other token, I think most engineers are curious about both, they don't want to not include security, but there does seem to be a gap of where they don't really know what to do. So by having the mitigations there, it's a very small step, but it's hopefully a step in that direction.
Would you all be interested in how to word this to a non-nerd so that they listen?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think in part the threat, and I'm jumping around here. I think in part the kind of threat evidence could help with that because some of this is written in less technical language or just CTI reports.
Yeah.
So I think that's something to say, like, if you have a threat that you're concerned about, you pull up one of these docs just to say, hey, this is real. We should be concerned with this.
Yeah.
Also, just to the chaining threats point.
Yeah. Well, I want to bring this up for that.
I was gonna say, that was originally part of the discussion, and we pulled it out.
Yeah.
So threats themselves are meant to, be that threat related to that property and that mitigation. In some threat descriptions, we'll include notes that say like, hey, by the way, this, if you're including this threat, maybe you should be looking at these other threats, or like in mitigations, we'll say, hey, if you do this mitigation, you should be concerned with these other properties and potentially these other threats, if it's not directly mapped to that property. But, we did want to leave a lot of the discretion of like the modeling itself to downstream users, such as, I guess, like the Xylem case of like, we provided the artifacts and everything that, the 90% way. And then that 10% way is going to be organizational specific, almost any way you cut it. So we kind of left that to the orgs.
And also, like, if you look at this process, there's lots of steps. There's lots of places for risks to come in here and people to say, we don't really need to care about that. So I think, and even like, because we're talking about the component itself. And so if you look at 62443, you can have processes that are probably certified to a high security level, but the components in them are not at that security level there. So I think there's a lot of room for people to use risk to like lower the security level of the device. We're kind of saying, let's start with this and that's going to happen. Like we know that's going to happen. We can start with a higher bar. And
quick question. Has this been
I think we just did CWE.
Not yet.
okay?
Maybe never. I don't know. I'm not familiar with that, so I'm not sure.
It's the hardware one, right? For hardware and software.
Okay.
Yeah. So with sorry.
You guys should connect on that.
Okay.
Yeah,
Definitely.
I'm thinking that it may be good for you talk about hardening, right? This is a way to harden these devices, configure your devices so that they're less vulnerable to be exploited. Help give out and make those configurations as a web server, that built in with things like that.
Right. Yeah. I'll definitely look into it. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. This is
Yeah, we're at time. Thanks, everyone.